So welcome everyone. My name is Phyllis Lockett. I am the founder and CEO of Leap Innovations, and I am so thrilled to be here with just an icon. I don't know anyone else to describe Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's the President Emerita of Spelman College and the author of the acclaimed book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race. We've been talking about this, and I've been so excited about this opportunity to be here with you today. And we wanted to start a bit more interactive. We know it's the afternoon, and Dr. Tatum has a question for all of you. So why don't we kick off that way?
I do, and I'm happy to be here. So first of all, let me just say I'm delighted to be in conversation with you, and delighted to be here at this summit. And glad you all chose to be here in this room with us right now at 2 o'clock. So I told Phyllis when we were talking about our conversation that I always like to start my conversations by asking a few questions of the audience, and so I want to do that here. So let me begin by asking each of you to think about your own earliest race-related memory. Go back as far as you can. And now I'm going to ask you if you've thought of something, knowing I'm not going to ask you to tell it. There's no risk in raising your hand here. So have you thought of a race-related memory that goes back maybe to your childhood? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, great. Almost everybody did. And so my question now, which does require some information back, is how old you were at the time of the thing you remembered. So you can either call out ages or hold up fingers. 5, 4, 8. I heard as old as 8, as young as 4. Raise your hand if you're somewhere between 4 and 8 in your own memory. A lot of people. Now let me just say there's no right answer to this question. You might have said I was 15 or 25. A lot of it will depend on where you grew up and what your social context is. But now the question, and you can't do this with your hands, unfortunately, but you do have to call out some words. For those of you who are coming in, we're talking about early race-related memories. And so the question is, what emotion, if any, what feeling or emotion is attached to this thing that you remembered, the incident or event you recall?
Fear.
Fear? Surprise. Someone said surprise. Confusion? Devalued? Interest? Embarrassment? Guilt? So far we've heard anger, surprise, confusion, interest, guilt. Am I leaving something out? I think I hit the most. Sometimes people say sadness, sometimes people say, I think I heard fear. Sometimes people say anger. There are all kinds of words we might use to describe the experiences we had early on. But now the question I want to ask, raise your hand if you're, even if you didn't call out a word, but did we hit one of your words? If there's a word, we got the essence of it. Sometimes people say things like happiness or joy, because maybe they're remembering something that was a very positive experience in the context of a friendship or a loving relationship. But more often are the words we heard, just uncomfortable words describing discomfort of some kind. So now my question is, thinking back to that incident, did you have a conversation with an adult, a concerned adult, either a parent or a teacher, some concerned adult in your life at the time that it occurred? Raise your hand if you did. Okay, looks like we've got maybe a dozen hands up. Raise your hand if you did not. It's pretty clear there are more did nots than dids in this room, and that is almost always the case. I ask these questions all the time, and almost always more people will say, I did not have that conversation, than people who will say did. But I am imagining some of you are acquainted with 5 and 6-year-olds, 4, 5, 6-year-olds, your own or somebody else's. And if you have some firsthand experience with young children, tell me if you agree they're pretty candid, right? They don't filter much, right? They just tell you what's on their minds. So it's always interesting to me as a psychologist to sit in a room with a room full of people who say, I had an early experience, it made me uncomfortable in some meaningful way. Years later, I still remember it, and yet I did not, even though I was at that stage of not filtering, I did not talk about it with the adults in my life. Why not? What's your thought about that?
I think in some instances it made the adults uncomfortable as well.
In some instances, it made the adults uncomfortable as well. And even at the age of 4 or 5 or 6, we've already figured out that adults do not like us to talk about certain topics. And talking about race is one of those topics. I like to always start our conversations by making the point that most of us, if not all of us, most of us certainly, have learned early in our lives that this is a topic you're not supposed to talk about. That one way or another that has been communicated to us, and as a consequence, now, you know, and I want to argue that even though I asked you to think about your earliest memory, my guess is it's not your only memory. And if it's not your only memory, there are probably multiple times in your life, if not a lot of times in your life, when you got the message, this is a topic not to be talked about.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I love that opening because it creates the right environment for us to be safe to have this conversation, because we really do have to talk about race. We're serious about
You can't solve
education.
a problem you can't talk about.
We have to.
And you can't talk about equity in education without talking about not so much race, but race and racism. You know, those ideas are linked.
Exactly. So can you share with us your personal story? What got you on this journey from your family history and your own personal story that led you to take on this body of work?
Well, it's a great question, and I often describe myself as a Brown versus Board of Education baby because I was born in 1954, several months after that Supreme Court decision, but also because my family was very much shaped, my early family life was shaped by segregation and desegregation. So what do I mean by that? When my parents were both college educated at Howard University, which is, I'm sure everyone knows, a historically black college, university in Washington, D.C., and my dad, they were actually both art majors, and my father went on to earn an MFA from the University of Iowa in the early 50s, and fast forward to 1954, my parents are married, I'm their second child, and my father is teaching at Florida A&M, which is also a historically black institution. And he was interested in earning his doctorate. He had a master's degree, but obviously to advance in higher ed, you need a doctorate. And he wanted to get his doctorate in art education and would have liked to do that at Florida State. Florida A&M, as you may know, is in Tallahassee. Florida State is also in Tallahassee. And, you know, just across town from they're across town from each other. He was not able to go to Florida State because of segregation. It was a whites-only institution at that time. And even though it was after Brown versus Board of Education, southern states were very slow to desegregate. And, but the law required providing access, and the way Florida complied with the law was by paying his transportation out of the state.
So let me be clear. So they paid, instead of allowing your father to get his master's degree at Florida State, they paid for him to go to a different college outside of the state of Florida.
That is correct.
Okay.
And that was very common at that time. I mean, if you talk to black people of a certain age who have gotten degrees, they lived in the South, but they traveled north because, sometimes at the expense of the southern state, because you know, they refused to desegregate. So my father got his degree at Penn State. And the state of Florida, he always told me, they didn't pay his tuition, but they paid his train fare from Florida to Pennsylvania. So he got his degree at Penn State in 1957. And my parents, at that time, my older brother was 5 going on 6, and they were determined not to have him educated in Florida schools. So we moved. My father got a job teaching at a college in Massachusetts. We moved to Massachusetts in 1958. He became the first African-American professor at that institution, which was Bridgewater State College, now known as Bridgewater State University, and I grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts.
Wow.
So fast forward, right? So Bridgewater, Massachusetts is a small town, was small then, still small, a very small black population. Most of my life, I was the only black kid in my class. And, but went away to college and very interested in psychology, went to Michigan, got my PhD at the University of Michigan. And while I was a graduate student, and my plan was to be a clinical psychologist and be a therapist. That was my plan. But while I was in that ABD status, which stands for all but dissertation, you know, I've done my graduate work and I'm writing my dissertation, I got married and I moved to California. And my husband had a job at UC Santa Barbara, and I was the trailing spouse and working on my dissertation, but I got a part-time teaching job. So I was invited to teach a course called Group Exploration of Racism, which was offered in the Department of Black Studies at UCSB. I'm a psychologist. You might say, well, what do you know about group exploration of racism? I didn't know a lot about that, but I knew how to facilitate groups because I was a trained clinician. And they couldn't find anybody who wanted to teach the class because it wasn't a traditional lecture class. It was much more about facilitating this dialogue. And so I was 26 years old, and I said to myself, how hard could that be? and so I signed up to do the class, needed the money, and did the class. But what happened was, at the end of the semester, at the end of the quarter, my students wrote on their evaluation something like, these comments like, this course has changed my life. Everyone should be required to take a class like this. Why did I have to wait till I was a senior in college to have a conversation about this issue? That was the feedback, and so I was, you know, jazzed by that and decided I would keep teaching it, which I did for 4 years while we were in California. And then by that time I decided, you know, being a clinical psychologist and a therapist is fine. I was doing some of that too, but I really felt called to do this other work. So. That's what I've been doing ever since then.
But growing up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, you had to be one of those kids that were sitting together.
No, I didn't.
Were you?
I didn't have to be because there weren't enough.
There weren't enough. Well, okay, you may have been sitting. You may have been sitting by yourself, actually.
Yes, right. So I mean, so literally, I mean, when I was at Bridgewater Rainham Regional High School, I did not sit with the black kids because there were hardly any. Yeah. You know, me and 2 twin sisters in my grade. But when I got to college, I was definitely, I went to Wesleyan University in the early 70s and was definitely sitting.
Yeah, I was one of those kids too, and I'm sure a lot of the African Americans in this room had very similar experiences in high school and college and graduate
Can I say a word about that, though?
Please.
I mean, of course, we were sitting together, but the white kids were sitting together, too.
I know.
And no one ever says...
It's usually more obvious when we're sitting together.
but it's important to say because in today's world, the group that is most racially isolated are actually white European Americans. And there was a poll that I write about in my book where all the black kids sitting together in the 2017 version that talks about social networks and the composition of social networks, and 75% of white adults participating in that survey indicated that their social networks were entirely white, which is a higher percentage than any other group.
I was going to get to that later, but since you're on it, you know, the bridge to the isolation that white millennials feel. Can you just talk a little bit more about that survey and the linkages to the, I don't know, we call it just the difference between colorblind and color silent.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So this survey was done by PRRI, and they found that 75% of white adults have entirely white social networks, which is a higher percentage than any other group in the United States. So when we talk about racial isolation, we often are talking about the isolation of people trapped in poverty and in segregated communities, but the most racially isolated group is actually white adults, and isolated white adults are likely to have isolated white children. But when so I write a lot about race, and when I give talks, as I do a lot of places, when I'm giving talks about my book, people will often say, well, you know, don't we want our children to be colorblind? But what I want to say is that what we learn is not to be colorblind, but to be color silent. And in fact, that exercise we did at the very beginning, you know, where I asked each of you to think about an early race-related memory, my guess is, without knowing what the incident was, it involved at least noticing somebody's racial difference. And it's not like you didn't see it, but the silence around it, the socialization around it is notice but don't mention, you know, and then pretend you didn't notice.
Yeah.
And that color silence is really unproductive. It leads to a lot of dysfunctional behavior.
Yeah, so what happens? What happens when we're color silent? Because I think, you know, it's safer to be color silent. But how does that translate when many of the people in this room are educators or technologists that are developing solutions for mostly Black and brown children that are representative in our public school system today? What happens when we're color silent?
We don't solve problems, you know? So the title of our session is, you know, the ABCs of inclusive leadership, so this might be a good place to talk about those ABCs, because that is actually an acronym that I use to describe 3 things that I think everyone should do if you're wanting to be an inclusive leader. And the first is affirming identity, right? You can't affirm somebody's identity if you refuse to see it, right? So, so the A of the ABCs is affirming identity. I'll tell you the 3 and then I'll talk about which they are. A, affirming identity. B, building community. C, cultivating leadership. And particularly in educational contexts, I think this is really important. I've been to a number of sessions over the course of this conference where people in different ways have talked about how important it is to affirm and recognize identity. And I always like to say that if we're thinking about this, we have to think about who we are in a particular space. I want all of you to imagine there's a photographer up front taking a photograph of everyone in this room. And at the end of our time together, you're going to get a copy of that photograph. And the question I would ask is, you get your copy of the photo, this group photo we took, what's the first thing you're going to do with your copy of the photograph? You're going to look for yourself. That is the only honest answer to that question. You are going to look for yourself. You're going to look for yourself, and once you find yourself in the picture, then you're going to evaluate how you look, right? And so not only do you want to find yourself in the picture, look for yourself, you also want to find yourself in the picture looking good, right? And so,
Absolutely.
So if we think about our school environments or our work environments as like that big photograph that we step into, we want to see ourselves in that picture, not only in it, but looking good. But let's imagine that through the wonders of modern technology, you're right in the center of this picture, hard to miss, except for the fact that before you got your copy, someone digitally removed you. You would wonder, what's wrong with this picture? I was there, I'm supposed to be in this picture, but for some reason I'm not. And at first, you might wonder what's wrong with the picture. But if you found yourself repeatedly having this experience, repeatedly getting the photo back, repeatedly being removed, you would start to wonder not what's wrong with the picture, but what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? How come me or people like me have not been included? So the very first thing is we have to think about how we let people know that they've been included, how we affirm their identities, and how that is made visible. And there are lots of different ways. I mean, in colleges, we talk about creating affinity groups. Workplaces do that too. Affinity groups is one way to affirm identity. But to come back to your question about color silence, let's imagine that someone said, I don't see color, I treat everyone the same. The best response I ever heard to that is this question: the same as what? The same as though we're all white, the same as though we're all male. You know, what does that mean? And so, so when we talk about being able to recognize people's individual experiences, that their identities shape those experiences. And if you don't see those identities, you don't know their experiences and won't find out. That's the A.
Oh, please. Keep going.
Okay, shall I keep going?
No, keep rolling. Nope, keep rolling.
Okay, all right. The B, building community, particularly in an educational setting, though I think really it's true for any work setting, we are trying to bring people together so that we have a shared sense of mission, a shared sense of, you know, working together to achieve certain goals. We're all part of this group moving forward. And if you think about the things that organizations do to create that shared sense of vision and mission, you know, we do lots of different things. We hold gatherings and we talk about it and we have strategic planning. We do lots of things. But if we don't think about the A when we're planning the B is not going to work very well.
Right. Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yes, please.
I did want to circle back on the A for a minute, because we got into this really deep discussion about the impact of not having the A on a child's brain development. Can you just talk a little about that?
Well, certainly one of the things that we know, in fact, yesterday I was at a presentation by a cognitive neuroscience scientist on a panel who was talking about how deeply important it is to feel affirmed and valued in terms of brain development.
Sense of belonging.
A sense of belonging, exactly. And from a college point of view, you know, speaking as a former college president, if we think about recruitment and retention, the thing we know that is most significant to retention and subsequent completion is a sense of belonging, that you're most at risk for dropping out if you don't feel like you belong as a member of a community. So creating that because it's such an important need, if it's not being met, you're using your cognitive resources to try to get the need met, as opposed to focusing on the thing you're supposed to be learning.
Can you mention the research that helped really drive that home around malleability that was done at the college level? Because I think it's a really practical example of how a number of the educators in this room are thinking about how they're reshaping and designing learning experiences in the K-12 space.
Yeah, well, so there are lots of examples I might use, but one of them I'm just gonna, I want to put it in the context of the research on stereotype threat.
Yep.
And so I'm assuming people are familiar with the research, but maybe not, at least the phrase stereotype threat. If you're not familiar with it, raise your hand if you know what stereotype threat is, or you think you do. Not everybody, okay. So stereotype threat is a kind of performance anxiety that you can experience when you are part of a stigmatized group and you are aware of what the stereotypes are about your group. And even if you don't believe them to be true yourself, if you know that other people have them and are projecting them onto you, you may be nervous about confirming that stereotype. And your own nervousness about confirming the stereotype leads you to a kind of immobilizing anxiety. So let's imagine this. Let's imagine that this is a physics class, and you are the only black woman in the physics class. And physics is stereotypically male, and STEM feels stereotypically white, and you're the only black student in this class, and you have a question about a concept that I, the physics professor, have been talking about. And so the question is, are you going to raise your hand and ask your question? Maybe you're not, because if you do, you will confirm the stereotype that, you know, you can't do that work or you don't belong in that class. But if you don't ask the question, you then remain confused and your performance is inhibited, right? Now, I'm using that around science, but I have, I'm a very proud mom of 2 sons. One of my sons is a social psychologist, and he did his research, his doctoral research, on stereotype threat as it impacts white people when you ask them to talk about race.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay, and some of you might appreciate that there's some performance anxiety associated with that,
Yeah.
right? And it manifests itself by more verbal errors, less verbal fluency, kind of a tongue-tiedness that happens, and that's all about anxiety. If you ask the same person to talk about something that's not related to race, they perform just fine. But it's the stereotype about, oh, I'm going to put my foot in it and say something racist, that they worry about. So that is, that's what stereotype threat is. So the good news is that there are things that researchers have told us you can do to mitigate somebody's stereotype threat. And in particular, to use an example with Black and brown youth who are stigmatized sometimes in learning environments, if you are able to communicate very clearly that you have a high expectation and that you have high, not only you have a high standard. I really expect my students to write very well. And I've asked you all to write these essays. And because I have a high standard, I'm going to give you a lot of feedback. And I'm giving you a lot of feedback because I believe you can meet my standard with this feedback. And now here's all the things that's wrong with your essay, right? When you give feedback in that way, making clear that you have a high standard and that you have the high expectation, the feedback is positively received and students perform at a much higher level, revise and resubmit their work. If you just tell them, here's what's wrong with your essay, not so much. And so it's the message of communicating the high standard and the high expectation that helps mitigate that concern about stereotype threat as one example. And that's part of creating a sense of belonging. That, I'm welcomed here, I'm valued here, I'm supposed to be learning things, and yes, I'm going to get feedback, but it's because they love me that they're giving me this feedback.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's what we believe very strongly.
Yes, yeah. So that's so just to get to the C.
Oh, sorry.
I just want to get to the C.
Did you say the B?
The B is building community.
Building community.
And I was going to use the example of that photograph. Taking a group photograph, if you've had a bonding experience and then you take a group photograph together, that's a kind of community building activity, right? You're building a sense of community, but it only works if everyone's in the picture, right? If you've gathered everybody together and then some people are on the edges of the picture, they're not confident that they're going to be in it, they don't participate. The building community only works if you've taken care of the A. The A and the B have to go together. And the C is about cultivating leadership, which has to do with making sure that we are developing the skills we need to be able to lead in an inclusive way. What we know, particularly at the college level, but in the workplace too, most people are coming into the new environment from a segregated community. We already talked about the white isolation. The kids of color are often coming from segregated environments as well, and that means they've had little opportunity to practice connecting across lines of difference. But if you're going to be effective in the 21st century, you better know how to do that. The data around the population, I'm sure people know, but I think it's worth saying here, that if you are under 21 years old, if you're in that cohort of 21 or younger, only 52% of that population is white. 48% is everybody else. If you don't know how to connect across those lines of difference, you're really setting yourself up for a social obsolescence. When I was born in 1954, the US population was 90% white, 10% everyone else. That's a big change. And when, I started saying, when we hear people talking about making America great again, you can translate that to making America white again. But the fact of the matter is, if you're looking backward, that's what you see. But when you look forward, you will definitely see an increasingly diverse environment where we are rapidly moving to a pluralistic society where there's no one majority.
Yeah, and I think that's what's igniting. We've been talking a lot about the current context in which our country is finding itself, what we're living through right now, that is really igniting these conversations, the necessity, honestly, to have these conversations more out loud.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit, you talked about the seesaw a bit, and, in terms of, it was almost like there was this sense of, I know I had when, Obama became the first African-American president. There's just this sense that, wow, things have turned the corner.
Yes.
That we really have come such a long way. But
Yes.
it's almost like the exact backlash has happened. Can you just
Yes.
talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, let me just point out that we are just a few days past April 4th, which was the
Martin Luther King.
51st anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. And in 1968, he wrote a book called Where Do We Go From Here? Subtitled Chaos or Community. And it was his last book, and in it, I highly recommend reading it if you haven't, because even though it was written in 1968 and the language is kind of dated to the language we used in 1968, the ideas are very much descriptive of what we see in 2019. And one of the things he said was that the line of progress is never straight. After every period of forward motion, there's this period of pushback or resistance against that social progress. And I think you can, it's pretty clear to me that we're in a period of pushback. So one of the things that happens when there's forward movement, that sort of shifts the status quo, there's a sense of disruption that occurs, particularly for those who are in the dominant or advantaged position. When I talk about racism, as I write about in Why Are All the Black Kids, that the definition I use is racism is a system of advantage based on race. And if you understand that racism systematically advantages some people, systematically disadvantages others, then what you know is that if you're trying to work against racism, you're disrupting that system of advantage. Phyllis and I were talking ahead of time about this conversation, and I used an analogy that I used in my classes a lot, which is, I don't know if any of you had the experience of playing on a seesaw when you were kids, right? But if you've been on a seesaw, one person's up here, the other person's down there, and then one person comes up, the other person goes down. But if you're up here, let's imagine the seesaw is stuck, or you're on it and your brother is sitting down there and he's just holding it down and you're up. And you're looking out and you got a great view, but the fear you have is that he's gonna jump off and you're gonna crash, right? If you think about our society as being sort of in this structure, dominant, subordinate, and trying to level it out, as this side comes down just a little bit, the panic is, oh no, they're gonna jump off and I'm gonna crash.
It's palpable.
And that, I think, is what we see. And whenever we are talking about creating more equitable systems, if we move just a little bit toward equity, what happens is panic amongst those who are used to being in that upper seat, because it feels like, oh no, I'm gonna lose everything, it's gonna crash. Why do we have to suppress the vote? Oh no.
Yeah. That's good psychology
Yeah.
for me. That was really good therapy for me. We've literally been living on this this challenge of the seesaw.
Yeah, and the goal is not to tilt it.
Tilt it. So how can we talk about balancing it? Like, talk to us about that. And
we can talk about it.
Yeah.
In that sense,
Yeah.
that's part of the challenge. But if we talk about creating more opportunity for some, it does, by definition, mean there may be less opportunity for others, but it doesn't mean it's going to be unfair.
Or is it zero sum? Does it have to be zero sum?
It doesn't have to be zero sum if we can think about how we expand opportunity, right? We can think about how we expand opportunity. Yesterday, I was on a panel about the admissions scandal, and clearly that was a zero sum. There's a certain number of seats at that institution, and if this person gets it, then that person doesn't. But we don't have to think about it in that way.
When I think about the ABCs and we think about the context of our mutual desires to serve students.
Yes.
That unless we do this for ourselves, I don't think we can legitimately say that we are serving students. So, can you just talk a bit about?
Say more about what you mean.
Well, it's just that, if we aren't actively thinking about how we create balance in the seesaw, how we create inclusive cultures, how we really think intentionally about cultural context and identity. If we're not doing that for ourselves and our organizations, how are we really going to do that for the students we serve? How do we claim, right?
Yes,
We are serving students.
Yes. Well, you have to model it. What I'm hearing in your question is, you can't teach what you don't know. And so if we want to create equitable environments in schools, we have to be operating equitably, right? Because otherwise it's inauthentic and not going to happen. And students will certainly see through that, and their families as well. But in the context of thinking about, as you were speaking, when you asked me the question at first, I was thinking about, we have to do this for ourselves, meaning we have to understand that it is in all of our interests to see change happen. Because even when we talk about systems of advantage, and sometimes when I was teaching, I would have students, I was president of Spelman College for 13 years, but when I was a faculty member, I was teaching in predominantly white institutions, a variety of them. And in one of them, one was a women's college, Mount Holyoke College, but another one was a co-ed school, and I remember having a young man in my class, Westfield State College, and he said to me, I've learned a lot in this class, and I see I'm in an advantage group, but my question is, why would I want to change that? Right, it's working for me, right, And I said, well, you think it's working for you, but the fact of the matter is there's no such thing as a free lunch. What I mean by that is that there's a cost to that, and that cost, particularly as our population changes, is that you're living in an increasingly dysfunctional society. You're living with an increasing fear and anxiety. I'm listening as an Audible book right now to a really interesting book that just came out this year titled Dying of Whiteness. If you haven't read it, I would recommend it. I haven't finished it, but I'm listening to it, and one of the things that the author talks about is that a lot of the policies that white people have embraced are also policies that are killing them. So for example, he uses the state of Missouri as a state where there are very liberal gun carry laws. You can carry your guns, and he talks about the history of gun ownership. There was a time when only free white people were allowed to carry guns. And so there is a long history of gun ownership as being sort of a symbol of status for white men. And in Missouri, where you get to carry your guns and you can walk around with them on your hip or carry them openly in Walmart or wherever you go, you get to do that if you're white. Because if you're a black man walking around with a gun openly carried around, somebody's going to call the police and they're going to come and shoot you, right? So because you're perceived as a threat. But this is to say, even though, so how does that connect to dying of whiteness? The rate of white male death by gun, suicide deaths, is higher in that state than any place else. And so on the one hand, there's this privilege of having it. On the other hand, it's a privilege that is resulting in a very high rate of white male suicides. So that's the downside of the privilege, right? It's the downside of the privilege. So that's just one example. There are many examples. I know we're almost out of time.
Yeah, we are. But I think inherent to what you're saying is that we've got to figure out how to articulate the incentives for all of us to, we're in this together.
Yes.
And to be able to coalesce around inclusivity and developing the practices that are going to help elevate our students, elevate our own humanity.
Absolutely.
And how that starts within our organizations around inclusive leadership. Any final thoughts or advice on that in terms of if we go back into the world, into the wild, which we're going to be doing after this conference?
The closing sentence in Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here, is where he says, this might be our last chance to really think about these questions. And ultimately, this is a paraphrase, but ultimately he says we have a choice to make. And I really feel that choice being ever present in this particular political moment. And the choice is between chaos or community. If you want community, You have to affirm identity, you have to build community, you have to cultivate leadership.
Please
Thank
join
you.
me in welcome and thanking so much Dr. Beverly Tatum.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You're awesome.